Welcome to your training on FERPA and student privacy. What is FERPA? FERPA is defined as the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, which is overseen by the U.S. Department of Education, and it governs student records privacy. Under FERPA, students have the right to inspect and review their educational record and also to request amendments to their educational record. They have the ability to restrict access to their educational record. Really, the right to privacy belongs to the student once they reach 18 years of age or enter a higher education institution, whichever comes first. They also have a right to be notified of their rights under FERPA annually, and also to file complaints with the U.S. Department of Education about alleged FERPA violations. When sharing student information, students' written consent is always required to share any information contained within the educational record with anyone who does not have a legitimate educational interest. Let's talk about what is a part of the educational record. So this could include emails or other electronic communications that have students' personally identifiable information, or PII, like names or student ID numbers. This also includes grades, electronic notes kept in a shared platform, application files of enrolled students, duty reports, and conduct records. Elements that are not a part of the educational record could be sole possession records, which are notes that you keep and are never seen by anyone else for advising or mentoring purposes. Any written communication that does not include students' PII, police reports or records, and application files of students who do not enroll at the institution. Let's talk about written consent. In order for a student to give written consent, the consent must include the following. It must be voluntary, a written document, also specify the type of information that the student permits to be released, and identify the parties to whom those disclosures can be made. Now at Pitt, we do this through the Waiver to Release Educational Records document, which is found at the Registrar's Office website or through the Pitt Policy website. This written consent remains valid until the student requests in writing that it be revoked or until the student's death. As an administrator, you may or may not have access to information related to written consent, and implied consent should never be considered. Another definition mentioned within FERPA is legitimate educational interests. So what does this mean? Now, this usually involves a school official who needs to review pieces of an educational record in order to perform their job duties at the university. You may ask yourself, do you have a need to know in order to best assist the student? Curiosity, unfortunately, does not fall under a legitimate interest. However, as an administrator, you may have a legitimate interest in knowing the student's educational information in your capacity at the university. What about health and safety emergencies? You may encounter times when there is a true health or safety emergency and you're called to act on behalf of one of your students. Written consent to share certain information is not required under FERPA if an articulable and significant threat is understood to be the case. In a situation where you feel a student may be putting themselves or others in danger, it may be necessary to notify other parties of the concern without consent of the student. There are some other exceptions under FERPA. So the university complies with requests for information from the institution for purposes of evaluating educational programs from educational governing bodies. Judicial orders or subpoenas must be complied with. Results of disciplinary hearings to alleged victims of sexual misconduct can also be released. The processing of financial aid does not require students' consent. And requests for information from an institution where a student seeks or intends to enroll can also fall as an exception. If students are claimed as dependents of their parents or guardians under Section 152 of the IRS Code, this may also be an exception to FERPA. Now, proof of this is always required when releasing information. With our Student Conduct Office, if the student violates any federal, state, or local law, or any other rule at the university regarding the possession of alcohol or controlled substance if the student is under 21, this information may also be released without the student's consent. Another exception is also the disclosure of directory information. So directory information is always defined by the institution itself. This is a list of what is considered directory information at the University of Pittsburgh. So this information can be released without the student's consent, and many of these pieces of information is available in the public Pitt directory. Let's talk about some procedural things. There is an option for students to submit a non-disclosure of directory information. Now, this is an opt-out process when it comes to being able to release directory information, because by default, all of this information is automatically being shared on a student's behalf. If a student chooses to submit a non-disclosure of directory information, they'll need to complete the form, which you can see here, which is found at the Registrar's Office website. This will be submitted to the Office of the Registrar, and the Office of the Registrar's staff will update the PeopleSoft record with a service indicator, also sometimes known as a FERPA flag, that appears as a blue window shade in PeopleSoft. This service indicator information is then updated in other systems across campus within 48 hours. If you happen to see that a student has this indicator on their record, please know that you may not release any information about this student, even if it is directory information, as they've specifically requested that their information be released to no one without their consent. Previously mentioned was also the waiver to release educational records, which allows students to be able to select persons to which their information can be disclosed. Now, this is an opt-in process. By default, students' educational records do belong to the student and their rights belong to the student. In order to submit the waiver, the student will complete the waiver form, which is included here and can be found at the Registrar's Office website or on the PIP policy website. The student will submit the waiver form directly to the Office of the Registrar or through their advisor or academic dean's office. Once received, the Office of the Registrar staff will update the PeopleSoft record with a service indicator. Currently, this is called Release Grades to Parent and can be indicated by a red star. In PeopleSoft, you will want to access the red star by clicking on it to access more information and to see to whom you're able to release certain pieces of academic information about the student. This service indicator information is then updated across other systems on campus. A few pieces of advice. Always think before you type. Now remember what's included in the educational record, and students can request to inspect and review their educational records at any time. If third parties are present while you're working with a student, you may want to ask if they're comfortable discussing in front of that third party, or if a more private conversation is preferred. You'll also want to avoid tutoring and mentoring conversations on social media platforms or any non-university managed media for FERPA privacy reasons. If you're contacting multiple students at once, you may want to choose to contact each individually or use the blind carbon copy function when you're emailing multiple students to protect privacy. You'll also want to try to avoid including grade or personally identifiable information in written communications where possible. If you can, try to be general. Now, in written communications where you do have to be specific about a student, the commentary should always be fact-based and not opinion-based. So try to avoid diagnosing or using any unprofessional or sarcastic language. Remember, students always have the ability to access this if they request it. Some note-keeping tips which can be helpful on shared platforms. You may want to ask yourself, are your notes true? Are they necessary, kind, and neutral? If you must be specific in the notes, report exactly what you're observing. Try not to interpret or add any personal commentary. Use general language whenever possible. If you choose to include sensitive information on a shared platform, you may want to let the student know that you plan to do so and ask their permission. You may also want to document policies or procedures that were discussed in your meeting, and also document action items. Let's go through a few scenarios to test your FERPA fluency. Here's one example. Pitt's Native American Student Organization wants to host a graduation celebration and has requested contact information for all graduating students who identify as Native American. If I were to supply such a list, would I be in violation of FERPA? The answer is yes. Race, gender, and ethnicity are not items that can be designated as directory information under FERPA. Pitt could provide information about the graduation ceremony to all students and let them know to follow up with the organization if they have interest in the inclination to do so. Here's another scenario. A faculty member contacts you about 3 students in their class and identifies them by name. They have a theory that students who transfer from community colleges underperform in the courses they teach, and they're looking to confirm this theory with those 3 specific students. Would it be a violation of FERPA to provide this information? In this case, yes. FERPA does permit an educational agency to disclose, without consent, personally identifiable information from students' records to school officials that have a legitimate educational interest. Generally, though, if a school official has a legitimate educational interest, they might already have access to this information. If you encounter individuals who have a need for data, there is usually a formal process by which they can request and receive de-identified student data for research purposes. Here's our last scenario. A student has granted a FERPA release to their parent. The parent has contacted the student's instructor asking about a student's course performance. Is the faculty member obligated to talk to the parent? The answer here is no. Assigned consent from the student permits the school to release information to the named party. However, there is no requirement that that institution provide the information. I like to think of FERPA as being a may, not a must. So we may provide information, however, we are not required to if a student elects this option. If you're looking for more resources or need more assistance around FERPA or FERPA-related issues, you can contact the Office of the Registrar or the Office of University Counsel.